The table has been laid since before dawn, and by the time the first guests are announced into the great hall of the Louvre, it looks less like a place to eat and more like an altar. 60 feet of white linen run the length of it, pressed so flat that the candlelight lies across the fabric in unbroken sheets, and on top of that linen sits silver enough to ransom a small province. Chargers and ewers and salt cellars worked into shapes of dolphins and coiled serpents, catching the flame of 200 candles until the whole surface seems to be quietly burning. Roast heron arrives first, dressed back in its own feathers so that it appears, for one theatrical moment, to be alive and simply resting on the platter. Behind it come pastries shaped like small fortified towers, their crusts gilded with real gold leaf beaten thin enough to eat, and wine the color of dark honey poured from ewers so heavy that the pages carrying them lean back slightly at the hip to balance the weight. It is August of 1572, in Paris, and the Valois court has gathered to celebrate a marriage that is supposed to end a war. Catherine de Medici sits near the head of that table in black, as she has dressed every day since her husband died 13 years earlier, and against the gold and crimson and peacock blue of everyone around her, the black reads as its own kind of statement. A woman who has outlived one king and now quietly directs the reign of another. Her face, in the accounts and portraits that survive from this period of her life, is heavy-jawed and watchful. A face built for listening rather than being read, and she watches this hall the way a woman watches a room she has spent 40 years learning to survive in. Her daughter Marguerite has just been married to Henri of Navarre, a Protestant prince, in a ceremony meant to bind two warring faiths into a single family and a single peace. Catholic lords sit beside Huguenot lords tonight for the first time in a decade without swords drawn between them. It is, by any measure of Renaissance spectacle, a triumph, gold and heron and gilded pastry standing in for the peace that France has not managed to hold for longer than a single generation. And beneath all of that gold, past the heron and the honeyed wine and the black silk composure of the woman at the head of the table, every single dish that reaches this hall has already passed through hands that do not appear anywhere in the paintings made of this evening. It has been touched, broken, sipped, and swallowed by servants whose names survive nowhere in the official record of this wedding. Low men standing at a sideboard along the wall whose entire function tonight is to die first, quietly, so that no one seated at the linen ever has to. The story of what that actually required of a human body, of what it meant to stand at that sideboard in August of 1572 and put a stranger's cooking into your own mouth before anyone with real power was permitted to touch it, is far stranger, far more physically brutal, and far more human than any painting of this banquet will ever let on. This is 1572, and France has spent the last 10 years tearing itself apart. Since 1562, Catholic and Protestant armies have fought each other across the length of the country in a conflict historians now call the French Wars of Religion. A war fought not at a single distant border, but inside the same towns, the same noble families, sometimes the same households, where a brother might kneel at Mass while his sister prayed from a Huguenot psalter down the hall. 4 separate rounds of open war have already been fought and uneasily paused by the summer of this wedding, and the peace each pause produced has lasted, on average, less time than it takes to plant and harvest a single crop. Every person seated in that hall tonight, Catholic or Protestant, noble or servant, is living inside a court where the line between a political rival and a man you might poison at supper has worn dangerously thin, and where the Queen Mother herself has spent more than a decade being whispered about, in pamphlets and sermons and quiet asides at foreign courts, as a woman who solved her political problems with something slipped into a cup. This video is about what that fear actually did to the human beings standing closest to the royal table, the men whose job was to put their own bodies between a suspect dish and the mouth of the Queen Mother of France. We will look honestly at how a 16th century court believed poison worked, at the strange menagerie of unicorn horn and serpent's tongue and toadstone that Renaissance nobles sincerely trusted to detect it, at the real poisons of the era and what they did to a body across the agonizing hours after a meal, and at the low, expendable, chronically frightened men who were paid to find out first. We will also look honestly at Catherine de' Medici herself and at how much of her reputation as a master poisoner was built not from proven fact, but from hostile pamphlets written by her political enemies. Because separating the woman from the legend turns out to matter enormously to understanding what her household actually feared. And why? Before we go further, if this is the kind of history you find worth staying up for, the real version rather than the flattering one, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this kind of carefully sourced history keep getting made. And, if there is an era or a court you would like told this same way, honestly and without the varnish, leave it in the comments. I read every one. Let us begin then, not with the Queen Mother at the head of that table, but with the boy standing at the sideboard behind her, because his body, not hers, is the one that will tell us what a night like this one actually cost. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Etienne Brachet, and in August of 1572 he is 19 years old, 3 years into a position at the Valois court that his family back in a milling village near Blois still describes, with a kind of anxious pride, as good fortune. Etienne is not a nobleman, and never will be. He is the eldest son of a miller who died in an accident with his own millstone 4 years earlier, leaving a widow and 4 children with a small debt and no reliable income, and Etienne's place in the royal household exists entirely because a steward with a distant connection to his mother's family agreed, as a favor that cost the steward nothing and meant everything to the Brachet household, to bring the boy into service as an aide of the pantry. Within 2 years, through no particular ambition of his own, that pantry position had quietly become something else, a rotation among the low servants assigned to taste dishes at the sideboard or credenza before they were permitted to travel any further toward the Queen Mother's table. Physically, Etienne is unremarkable in every way the court would consider worth commenting on, which is precisely why he was chosen. He is of middling height, thin through the shoulders in the way of a boy who has not eaten a full, satisfying meal in longer than he can comfortably remember, with hands roughened by pantry work and a face that nobody at court would recognize a week after seeing it. What is not visible to anyone glancing at him across a crowded hall is what 3 years of this particular duty have actually done to him. His stomach aches in a low, constant way he has stopped mentioning to anyone, a soreness that flares whenever a dish arrives heavily spiced or unusually rich, which at a royal table is nearly every dish. He sleeps poorly on nights before a large banquet, waking 2 or 3 times convinced his chest has gone tight or his mouth has gone strangely dry, only to lie still and count his own pulse in the dark until the fear passes or does not. He has developed a private habit, one he has never told another servant about, of silently naming his mother and each of his 3 younger siblings before he swallows anything unfamiliar. A small superstitious ritual that gives his fear somewhere to go in the half-second before the food reaches his tongue. Tonight, the eve of a royal wedding meant to end a war, is the largest and most dangerous service of Etienne's short career, and he knows it in the specific physical way a frightened body knows things, rather than the way a mind reasons them out. The hall is fuller than he has ever seen it, packed with Catholic and Huguenot lords who have spent the last decade trying to kill each other's soldiers on actual battlefields and are now expected to eat from the same kitchens under the same roof. Somewhere beneath the music and the candlelight and the extraordinary quantity of gold on that table, Etienne understands, with the plain clarity of a boy whose entire function tonight is to find out first, that if anyone in this hall has decided tonight is the night to settle an old grievance with poison rather than steel, his own body is the only thing standing between that decision and the Queen Mother of France. Let us follow him through what that actually meant, service by service, dish by dish. Because his body, not the black silk composure of the woman he serves, is what this night truly demanded. 2 months before this wedding, on the 9th of June 1572, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre and mother of the bridegroom, went out into Paris to buy clothes and jewellery for her son's marriage, fell suddenly ill within days, and was dead before the month was finished. She was 43 years old, by most accounts strong and active right up until her collapse, and her death landed in a court already saturated with suspicion the way a lit match lands in dry hay. Within weeks, the Huguenot side of the family she had just been visiting was saying openly what everyone at court had already started whispering, that Catherine de Medici had sent her a pair of gloves, scented by the Queen Mother's own Florentine perfumer, and that those gloves had killed her. If you picture the danger of a Renaissance royal court, you likely picture something closer to a duel than a dinner, a sword in a dark corridor, an ambush on a hunting trail, the kind of violence that leaves an obvious wound and an obvious enemy standing over it. That picture belongs to an earlier and simpler kind of political danger, and it is almost entirely the wrong picture for the court Etienne Brachet served in 1572. The actual reality of that summer is that France had been tearing itself apart along religious lines for a full decade, in a conflict historians now call the French Wars of Religion, a war that had already produced 4 separate rounds of open fighting since a massacre of Huguenot worshippers at Vassy in 1562 first broke the fragile peace between Catholic and Protestant France. Each round of war had ended in a treaty that both sides accepted publicly and trusted privately for perhaps a season before the killing resumed. And the marriage being celebrated in the Louvre this August was meant to be the treaty that finally held. A Catholic princess given to a Protestant prince, blood mixed with blood in the hope that it would be harder to spill afterward. Historians of the period, among them Robert Knecht, who has written extensively on the Valois court, and Barbara de Fendorf, whose research has focused closely on the religious violence tearing through Paris in these exact years, describe a capital in the summer of 1572 that was crowded well past its ordinary population with armed Huguenot nobles who had travelled from across France for the wedding, watched with open hostility by a Catholic populace that considered their presence in the city itself a provocation. Denis Crouzet, whose work examines the deeper mentality driving this era's violence, has argued that a culture already primed to see religious and political enemies as agents of literal spiritual corruption was a culture unusually ready to believe that death could arrive silently, disguised as illness, sent by an enemy too careful to leave a wound behind. Poison mattered so enormously to a court like this one precisely because it left no such wound. A blade in a corridor announced its author immediately, inviting retaliation. War. The collapse of whatever fragile piece a marriage like this one had just purchased. A death that looked like ordinary illness. A fever. A stomach complaint, a wasting sickness that a physician could plausibly attribute to bad air or an imbalance of the body's humours, accused nobody directly and could be denied indefinitely, which made it, to a court already exhausted by open war, a uniquely attractive and uniquely terrifying weapon at the exact same time. French law of the period treated the poisoning of a social superior as a particularly aggravated form of murder, an offence against the entire hierarchy binding servant to master and subject to sovereign, and a servant convicted of it could expect a public execution built to be as slow and visible as the crime itself had been secret, precisely because the law needed a punishment severe enough to counter a weapon that left almost no evidence behind it. That severity did not stop the fear. If anything, it fed it, since a punishment that extreme only confirmed, to every servant standing near a royal table, exactly how seriously the danger was taken by the people with the power to hand that punishment down. For a low servant like Etienne, the death of Jeanne d'Albret arrived not as diplomatic gossip, but as a kitchen rumour, passed hand to hand among the pantry staff and the pages within a day of the news reaching Paris, growing more specific and more frightening with every retelling. By the time the story reached Etienne, standing at the edge of the palace kitchens with a basket of bread on his hip, it had already acquired the exact shape it would keep for the rest of that summer a gift of perfumed gloves prepared by the Queen Mother's own Florentine perfumer, worn once and fatal within days. Etienne did not know, standing in that kitchen, whether the story was true. Neither, in any meaningful sense, did anyone else repeating it, and that particular uncertainty, the not knowing, layered on top of an entire decade of religious killing, is what made every dish leaving that kitchen for the rest of the summer feel, to the servants responsible for it, considerably heavier than its actual weight in silver and meat. The broader political context made the fear worse rather than better as the wedding week wore on. Gaspard de Coligny, the most prominent Huguenot nobleman in France and a trusted advisor whose growing influence over the young King Charles IX had already alarmed the powerful Catholic Guy's family and, by many historians' accounts, alarmed Catherine de Medici herself, was in Paris that week surrounded by armed Protestant retainers who did not fully trust the peace their own leaders had just signed. Every course carried out of that kitchen during wedding week travelled through a hall where Catholic and Huguenot nobles who had spent a decade trying to kill each other's soldiers were now expected to share bread, and the servants moving that food between them understood, without needing anyone to explain it, that a single poisoned dish served to the wrong guest could unravel everything the marriage had just been designed to hold together. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that almost none of the men and women eating from that table that week actually died of poison, that summer or any other. The fear itself did not require an actual poisoning to be constant, exhausting, and entirely reasonable. It required only a decade of civil war, a court stuffed with people who had real cause to want each other dead, and the plain, well-documented fact that poison had already killed at least one prominent woman connected to this very wedding, whether or not the hand that supposedly delivered it was ever real. Which is exactly why, by 1572, the simple act of moving a dish from a royal kitchen to a royal table had become one of the most elaborately ritualized processes in the entire household. A sequence of checks so formalized that a single roasted heron might pass through the hands of half a dozen separate officials before anyone with real power was permitted to lift a fork toward it. If you picture a royal food taster at all, you probably picture a single figure standing just behind the throne, sampling a spoonful of whatever the king is about to eat, while the king himself watches and waits. A single dramatic gesture performed once, in plain view, immediately before the royal mouth. That image belongs to popular imagination rather than to the documented reality of a court like the Valois household, where the actual system was considerably larger, considerably less visible, and considerably more exhausting for the people running it than a single tense moment behind a throne. The true architecture of food safety at a court like this one in 1572 involved an entire hierarchy of officers, each with a formal title and a specific stage of the meal under their protection. The panettiere oversaw the bread, breaking each loaf and each pie crust by hand before it left his station, checking for anything foreign worked into the dough or hidden under the surface of a crust. The Ekansen, the officer of the cup, tasted the wine directly from the vessel it would be poured from, and did so again once it had been poured into the cup that would actually reach royal lips, since a poison could in theory be introduced at either stage. The écuyer tranchant, the carver, cut and sampled the meat itself before it was arranged on its platter, and under all three of these titled officers stood a rotating body of lower servants, men exactly like Etienne, who performed the same basic function at earlier and less visible stages of preparation. In the kitchens themselves and at the sideboard called the credenza, where dishes were displayed, inspected, and formally tasted one final time before the procession carrying them to the royal table was allowed to begin. Sources on the period describe dishes undergoing this trial of assay, as it was formally called, as many as 3 separate times before reaching a royal table. Once in the kitchen where the dish was actually cooked, once at the pantry or buttery stage where ingredients like bread and wine were assembled and stored, and once at the credenza itself, immediately before the ceremonial procession into the dining hall began. The word credenza itself carries the entire logic of this system inside it. It descends from the Italian word credere, to believe or to trust, because the piece of furniture historians now call by that name in kitchens and dining rooms around the world began its life specifically as the sideboard where royal food underwent its final credence test, the formal act of establishing, through witnessed ritual, that a dish could be trusted. A queen sitting down to a state banquet was not, in any real sense, tasting the food herself for danger. She was accepting the word of a chain of servants who had already staked their own bodies on that judgment, and the credenza was where that final, most visible link in the chain performed its function in front of witnesses. For Etienne, stationed at the credenza on the night of the wedding banquet, this meant a specific, repeated physical sequence that he had performed so many times across 3 years of service that his hands moved through it almost without conscious direction, even as his stomach tightened with every fresh dish set before him. When the roasted heron pie arrived at his station, still steaming, he broke a piece of its gilded crust away with his fingers, exactly as the panatia had trained him, checking with his eye and his thumb for any seam or discoloration that should not have been there, before placing a small piece directly into his own mouth and chewing it slowly enough that the steward standing 3 feet away, watching him with the flat professional attention of a man whose own position depended on Etienne's honesty, could see every motion of his jaw. He did the same with a spoonful of the sauce beneath the bird, and when the wine arrived in its heavy silver ewer, he dipped a small cup directly from it and drank before the steward's own eyes, holding the wine in his mouth a beat longer than strictly necessary, a habit he had developed without quite deciding to, as though a slower swallow might somehow give him more warning if something was wrong. Then he waited, standing at his post while the music continued and the hall filled around him, counting silently through what felt, every single time, like considerably longer than the few minutes it actually took, before the steward gave the small, unremarkable nod that meant the dish could finally continue its journey toward the Queen Mother's table. The broader picture behind this ritual is more complicated and more honest than the calm ceremony itself would suggest. Historians examining the assay system across multiple European courts, not only the Valois household, but the Ottoman and English courts as well, have generally agreed that the ritual functioned as much to manufacture visible confidence as to provide actual protection, since a sufficiently patient poisoner using a slow-acting substance could easily defeat a taster whose only real test was weather. He collapsed within the next few minutes. The system was never designed around that possibility, because acknowledging it openly would have undermined the entire point of the ceremony, which was to let a queen sit down to a banquet surrounded by her enemies and choose, visibly and publicly, to believe she was safe. The credenza did what its name promised. It manufactured belief, performed in front of 200 watching guests, whether or not that belief was, in any strict chemical sense, fully earned. There is a quiet observation worth carrying out of this chapter and into everything that follows. The elaborate procession of officers and titles and formal tastings that surrounded Etienne every single night was not really built to catch a determined poisoner. Not entirely, and the more experienced servants in that kitchen understood this even if they never said it aloud to anyone above their own station. It was built to let everyone at that table, from the youngest page to the Queen Mother herself, share in a single collective performance of safety, and every one of them depended on the same handful of low, expendable men to hold that performance up, night after night, one swallow at a time. Which raises the question almost nobody at that banquet would have asked aloud, though every servant standing near the credenza had answered it for themselves long before the wedding week began. Who actually agreed to take a job where the plain, unspoken description was to find out first, with your own body, whether tonight was the night someone decided to kill the Queen Mother of France? If you picture the person filling this role, you probably imagine either a prisoner given no real choice in the matter, or a martyr of unusual courage who volunteered out of loyalty to the crown. Neither picture matches the servants who actually staffed the credenza and the royal kitchens of Renaissance France with any regularity. The actual reality is considerably more ordinary and considerably sadder. The men who performed the physical work of tasting at the lower stages of the royal kitchen, in the pantry, at the buttery, at the credenza itself, were overwhelmingly drawn from the same pool of low household servants who filled every other unglamorous position at court. Young men without land, without a trade, and without any better offer available to them. A position in the royal kitchens came with food, a bed, a small but real wage, and the kind of institutional protection that a family with nothing else to fall back on could not easily refuse, whatever fears attached themselves to the specific duty of tasting. Historians examining the structure of Renaissance royal households have noted that this was, in a very direct sense, the point. A servant who could be replaced without political consequence, who had no powerful family to avenge his death, and no faction at court that would treat his poisoning as an act of war requiring retaliation, was a servant whose loss cost the crown almost nothing beyond the inconvenience of training a replacement. The same low status that made a man's death politically insignificant was precisely what made him safe to place between a suspect dish and a queen's mouth. This calculation existed alongside, and in stark contrast to, a completely different set of ambitions attached to the more senior titled positions in the same chain. The formal offices of the mouth, the panatia, the achanson, the acquia tranchant, were frequently held by young men of real noble birth, sons of minor lords, who competed actively for exactly this kind of appointment, not despite the proximity to danger, but because of the proximity to power that came attached to it. Standing close enough to a monarch to serve their bread or pour their wine was, at a court like the Valois household, a form of political capital nearly as valuable as land, a visible sign of royal trust that could translate into future appointments, favorable marriages, and access to the kind of influence a minor noble family desperately needed to climb further. For a young lord's son holding one of these titles, the formal ritual of tasting was, in practice, a brief and largely symbolic gesture performed once, publicly, at the most visible and least dangerous stage of the meal, a performance of loyalty rather than an authentic daily exposure to risk. For the low servant standing under him in that same chain, doing the actual repeated tasting at every earlier stage of preparation, the same basic act carried none of that glamour and all of the actual danger. For Etienne, the path into this position had nothing to do with ambition of any kind. His father, a miller in a village not far from Blois, had died 4 years earlier in an accident with his own millstone, leaving Etienne's mother with a small debt, 3 younger children, and no reliable source of income beyond what the mill itself, now leased to a cousin on unfavorable terms, could provide. A distant connection on his mother's side, a steward with a minor post in the royal household, had agreed to bring Etienne into service as a favor that cost the steward almost nothing, and meant, to the Brachet family, the difference between a household that could feed itself and one that could not. Etienne's mother wept when the letter arrived confirming the position, though whether from relief or from fear, Etienne was never entirely certain. And in the years since, the wages he sent home twice yearly by a trusted carter had paid off the family debt entirely and kept his youngest sister fed through 2 hard winters. When the pantry work had quietly expanded, without any formal announcement or choice offered to him, into a rotation that included tasting duty at the credenza, Etienne had understood immediately that refusing was not a real option available to a boy in his position, not if he wanted to keep sending money home, and he had never written to his mother about the specific nature of what his duties had become, telling her only, in the brief letters his limited education allowed him to compose, that he served well and was fed regularly, both of which were, strictly speaking, true. The broader context here matters because it corrects an assumption that flattens a genuinely complicated social reality into something simpler than it actually was. Royal food service in Renaissance France was not one job performed by one type of person, but a layered structure in which the same physical space, the same kitchen, the same credenza, held 2 entirely different meanings depending on who was standing in it. A young lord's son at that sideboard saw a stepping stone toward influence he could use for the rest of his life. A miller's orphaned son standing beside him saw a wage that kept his mother's household from starvation, and a danger he had never been given any meaningful choice to decline. Both of them were, in the strictest technical sense, performing the same duty. Only one of them had ever been permitted to imagine it as an opportunity. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward here. The court needed both kinds of men at that sideboard, the ambitious and the desperate, because the ritual required a visible, titled noble to lend the ceremony its dignity, and it required an expendable, low-born body to actually absorb whatever risk the ceremony was theoretically designed to catch. Neither man standing at that credenza on the night of the wedding banquet would have described his own position in quite those terms. But the arrangement worked, if it worked at all, precisely because it had been built, quietly and over generations, to require exactly that division of who got the glory and who got the risk. Understanding why any of this was believed to actually work, why a boy chewing a piece of pie crust and waiting a few minutes in silence was thought to offer real protection against a killer as patient and as chemically sophisticated as a Renaissance poisoner, requires understanding what a 16th century body was believed to be made of in the first place, because the medicine of Etienne's era operated on a model of the human body that a modern listener would barely recognize as medicine at all. If you assume that a Renaissance physician diagnosing poison worked from something resembling modern toxicology, testing substances, tracing symptoms to specific chemical causes, you are giving Etienne's century credit for a kind of precision it did not yet possess, and, in most respects, would not possess for another 2.5 centuries. The actual medical framework governing every physician at the Valois court descended from the Greek physician Galen, refined across more than 1,000 years of subsequent scholarship, and rested on the belief that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, whose careful balance determined health, and whose disruption produced every illness a physician might be called upon to treat. Poison, within this system, was not understood the way a modern chemist understands it, as a specific compound producing a specific, mechanically explicable effect on specific organs. It was understood as a substance possessing what physicians of the era called an occult quality, a hidden property directly and violently opposed to the nature of human life itself, capable of corrupting the humours so completely and so quickly that the body's own internal balance collapsed under the assault. A physician examining a suddenly and mysteriously dead courtier looked for signs that fit this framework: a blackened or unusually discoloured heart or spleen at autopsy, an excess of bile, organs that appeared, to an eye trained in humoral theory, to have curdled or corrupted in a manner ordinary illness did not typically produce. These findings felt, to the physicians making them, every bit as rigorous and evidence-based as a modern pathologist's report feels today. They were simply built on a model of the body that had gotten several of its most basic premises wrong, in ways nobody at that court had any tool available to detect. For Etienne, this medical framework translated into a specific, memorized set of warning signs he had been taught to watch for in his own body during the anxious interval after every tasting, a checklist passed down informally from more experienced servants rather than from any physician directly. A sudden tightening across the chest, an unusual dryness, or a strange metallic taste lingering at the back of the tongue after the food itself had been swallowed. A cold sweat breaking out despite a warm hall. Any of these, he had been told, meant calling for the household physician immediately, without waiting to see whether the sensation passed, since the entire logic of humoral corruption suggested that early treatment, purging the corrupted matter before it spread further through the body, offered the only real chance of surviving a legitimate poisoning. Etienne had never, in 3 years of service, actually experienced any of these signs following a tasting, but he had catalogued them so thoroughly in his own mind, turning them over during the anxious minutes of every wait, that a simple twinge of ordinary indigestion after a rich sauce could send a jolt of real fear through him before his own memory of 100 previous, harmless twinges talked him back down. The broader context surrounding this belief system reveals just how seriously even the most skeptical minds of the era took the underlying premise, even as some of them quietly began testing its specific remedies against harder evidence. Ambroise Paré, the celebrated royal surgeon who served 4 successive French kings across his long career, including Charles IX on the throne during this exact wedding summer, described in his own writings an experiment he conducted around 1567, only a handful of years before Etienne's service began. To test the popular belief that a bezoar stone, a hardened mineral mass drawn from the stomach of certain animals and prized across Europe as a universal antidote to poison, could genuinely neutralize any toxin given to a poisoned man. A cook condemned to hang for theft from the royal kitchens was offered, according to Paré's own account, a private death by poison rather than a public execution at the gallows, on the condition that he would be given a bezoar stone immediately afterward and set free if it saved him. The cook accepted. The poison was administered, the stone was given exactly as promised, and the man died in evident agony some 7 hours later, disproving, at least to Paré's own satisfaction, the stone's supposed power over every possible toxin. Paré's willingness to test the claim at all shows a mind already reaching, however tentatively, toward the kind of empirical skepticism that would eventually replace humoral medicine altogether. His method for testing it, using a condemned man's body as the instrument of proof, shows just how little that emerging skepticism had yet changed about whose life was considered expendable enough to spend on an answer. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Etienne's entire understanding of his own body during every tasting, every anxious minute of waiting, every private catalogue of warning signs he had memorized without ever fully trusting them, rested on a medical model that even the most respected surgeon at his own king's court was already beginning to quietly doubt. He was not managing his fear with superstition while the learned men around him operated on solid science. He was managing it with the same imperfect, evolving, genuinely earnest attempt to understand a dangerous world that every physician, every surgeon, and every frightened servant at that court was making together. Each of them reasoning as carefully as their century allowed from evidence that would, in time, prove considerably less reliable than anyone standing in that kitchen could have known. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what actually sat on the credenza beside Etienne every night, because the tasting itself was only half of what the era believed stood between a royal mouth and a poisoned dish. The other half was a small, strange collection of objects that a modern listener would recognize instantly from a curiosity cabinet or a fairy tale, and that every serious person at the Valois court in 1572 regarded as true, functioning instruments of protection. If you picture Renaissance poison detection at all, you probably picture something closer to the tasting itself. A servant eating first. A brief wait. A verdict. What that picture leaves out entirely is the layer of belief sitting on top of the tasting. A set of objects credited with the power to detect or neutralize poison through means that had nothing to do with anyone actually swallowing anything. The actual reality of a well-equipped royal table in this period included, alongside its officers and its credenza, a small arsenal of what historians of material culture now call anti-poison amulets, objects believed, with complete sincerity, to react in the presence of a hidden toxin. The most prized of these was what the era called unicorn horn, a long spiraled tusk that European royalty had collected and displayed for centuries as proof against poison. Whole horns sometimes standing upright on a sideboard, while smaller fragments, called touches, were dipped directly into suspect wine or held against a dish before it was served. These horns were believed to sweat, discolor, or tremble if poison was anywhere near them, and a fragment ground into powder and stirred into a cup was considered, by many at court, a more reliable safeguard than any human taster standing beside it. What nobody at the Valois court knew, and what would not be established with certainty until whalers and naturalists began comparing notes across the following century, is that these horns were not the horns of any unicorn at all, but the long spiral tusks of the narwhal, an Arctic whale that no one at the French court had ever seen alive, its true origin obscured by the enormous distances the ivory travelled before reaching a European buyer willing to pay a real fortune for what he sincerely believed was a piece of a mythical animal. Alongside the horn sat other objects drawn from the same broad category of belief. Toadstones, small rounded stones that Renaissance naturalists insisted grew inside the heads of certain toads, were prized for their supposed ability to change color or grow warm in the presence of poison, and were frequently set into rings worn close against the skin for exactly this purpose. Bezoar stones, hardened masses of undigested matter drawn from the stomachs of goats and other animals, particularly a species of wild goat native to Persia, were perhaps the most widely trusted general antidote of the entire period. Ground into powder or dropped whole into a suspect cup, on the theory that the stone would absorb or neutralize whatever toxin the liquid contained. Fragments the era called serpents' tongues, actually the fossilized teeth of extinct sharks, though nobody at the time had any way of knowing this, were mounted in silver stands called credence trees and displayed prominently at the credenza itself, believed to sweat visibly if poison had been placed anywhere nearby. None of these beliefs held up to what a modern chemist would recognize as evidence. Every one of them was held, at the Valois court in 1572, with the same unshakable confidence a modern person holds toward a smoke detector. For Etienne, these objects were simply part of the furniture of his nightly work, familiar enough that he rarely stopped to consider their strangeness the way a modern listener naturally would. A fragment of what he had always been told was unicorn horn sat in a small silver stand near his station at the credenza, and on nights when a particularly rich or unfamiliar dish arrived, one of the senior stewards would sometimes dip the fragment briefly into the sauce before Etienne's own tasting began, a small extra ritual performed almost as reflexively as crossing oneself before a meal. Etienne found a true, if hard to explain, comfort in this additional layer of protection, not because he had ever seen the horn actually detect anything. In 3 years he had watched it fail to react to a single dish, poisoned or otherwise, but because its presence made the entire ritual feel more thorough, more serious, less dependent on his own single fallible body, standing as the only thing between a suspect dish and disaster. He had been given a small toadstone ring by his mother before he left for court, purchased at real expense from a travelling peddler who assured her it would protect her son from every danger a royal kitchen might present. And Etienne wore it every day of his service, less from confidence in its power than from the simple, private comfort of carrying something his mother had chosen specifically to keep him safe. The broader context surrounding these objects reveals something more interesting than simple credulity. Because even in Etienne's own lifetime, the most careful medical minds of the French court were beginning to test these very claims against harder evidence, and finding them wanting. Ambroise Paré, the royal surgeon whose humoral reasoning shaped so much of how Etienne's era understood poison in general, conducted his famous experiment on the power of the Bezoar stone in 1567, only 5 years before this wedding, offering a cook condemned to hang for theft a private death by poison instead, on the promise that a Bezoar stone would be given to him immediately afterward and that he would go free if it saved him. The cook accepted the bargain, was poisoned, received the stone exactly as promised, and died in evident agony some 7 hours later, disproving, at least to Paré's own considerable satisfaction, the stone's supposed power over every possible toxin. Paré published this account openly, and it circulated among the same educated circles that supplied the Valois court with its physicians, meaning that by the time of Etienne's own service, the most rigorous medical mind in France had already demonstrated, through an experiment as brutal as it was informative, that the very object many households still trusted as a universal antidote had failed its one direct test. That demonstration changed remarkably little about how bezoar stones, unicorn horns, and toadstones were actually used at court, and the reason why says something important about what these objects were really doing for the people who relied on them. A belief that has become woven into the daily performance of safety, repeated every single night, at every single meal for generations, does not simply dissolve because one surgeon, however respected, published one contrary experiment. The objects stayed on the credenza because removing them would have meant admitting, publicly and uncomfortably, that an entire tradition of protection the court had leaned on for as long as anyone could remember was built on foundations considerably less solid than anyone wanted to examine too closely, and because Etienne's own tasting, imperfect as it was, remained the only protection anyone could offer in its place. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour moves any further into what these tasters were actually protecting against. The unicorn horn on Etienne's sideboard never once, in 3 years, gave any sign of anything at all, and everyone standing near it that whole time, including men considerably better educated than Etienne, chose to read that silence as reassurance rather than as evidence the object simply did not work. A belief performed with enough consistency, night after night, in front of enough witnesses, becomes almost impossible to distinguish from a fact, which is precisely how a fragment of whale ivory came to sit at the heart of French royal security for the better part of 2 centuries. Which brings this hour to the actual danger that all of this ritual, chemistry and superstition alike, existed to guard against, because understanding what a real Renaissance poisoning looked like, chemically and physically, rather than through the lens of legend, changes considerably how you should picture the terror Etienne carried through every service. If you imagine Renaissance poison at all, you probably imagine something close to instant. A single dramatic sip, followed by an immediate and visible collapse, the kind of death a stage play or a modern film can compress into a single gasping scene. That image belongs to drama, rather than to the documented chemistry of the substances actually available to a poisoner in 1572. The actual reality of the era's most feared poisons is considerably slower, and considerably more useful to an assassin patient enough to exploit it. Arsenic, most commonly prepared as a fine white powder called arsenic trioxide, had by this period become the poison most associated with court intrigue across Europe. Precisely because it was odorless, essentially tasteless when stirred into a strongly flavored dish or a heavily spiced wine, and fully soluble in liquid, leaving no visible trace for a taster's eye to catch. Its symptoms, cramping, vomiting, a burning sensation through the stomach and bowels, closely mimicked the presentation of ordinary severe food poisoning or dysentery. Conditions common enough at any Renaissance table that a physician examining a victim had actual difficulty distinguishing a deliberate poisoning from an unfortunate week with spoiled meat. Belladonna, drawn from the deadly nightshade plant, produced a different but equally deceptive set of effects. Dilated eyes, flushed skin, disorientation, and a racing heart that could resemble fever or a fit of nervous excitement before the more dangerous effects set in. Corrosive sublimate, a preparation of mercury that Renaissance apothecaries and alchemists both handled regularly for other purposes, produced violent burning in the throat and stomach, uncontrollable thirst, and severe intestinal damage, a death considerably faster and more visibly agonizing than arsenic, but still capable, in smaller repeated doses, of mimicking a slow wasting illness rather than an obvious act of murder. What made these substances so dangerous to a court relying on tasters was not their speed, but their patience, and their vulnerability to timing. A skilled poisoner did not need a dish to kill within minutes to succeed. A dose small enough to produce no immediate symptom in a taster who swallowed only a modest bite, followed by a larger portion consumed later by the intended victim, could defeat the entire system of tasting without ever being detected at the credenza at all. Arsenic in particular was suited to this kind of patient, repeated administration, since a series of small doses spread across days or weeks produced a gradual decline that period medicine, already primed by humoral theory to see illness as an internal corruption rather than an external attack, would very often diagnose as a wasting fever or a disorder of the stomach rather than a deliberate poisoning. Right up until an unusually thorough autopsy, if one was performed at all, happened to notice something a trained eye considered suspicious. For Etienne, none of this chemistry was available to him in the terms a modern reader now has it, but its practical consequence shaped every single minute he spent waiting after a tasting, because the entire premise of his job assumed a poison would announce itself quickly enough for his own collapse to serve as warning. He understood, in the vague, half-articulated way a frightened 19-year-old understands a danger nobody has fully explained to him, that some poisons worked fast enough to be caught by his own body within the standard waiting period observed at the credenza, and that others, the ones the older, more experienced tasters spoke of in lowered voices when the stewards were out of earshot, might not show themselves at all until hours or even days later, by which point the connection to any particular meal would have grown impossible to trace with any confidence. This uncertainty did more to shape Etienne's private fear than any single dramatic threat could have, because it meant that even a night that ended in apparent safety, no cramping, no fever, no summons for the physician, offered him no true guarantee that the meal he had just tasted was actually clean. The broader picture here corrects a comfortable modern assumption about how effective the entire tasting system could ever have realistically been. Historians examining the documented poisoning attempts of the period have generally concluded that a patient, sufficiently informed poisoner working with slow-acting arsenic or a carefully calculated repeated dose stood an authentic chance of defeating even the most rigorous credenza system France could assemble. Which means that the elaborate ritual surrounding Etienne every night was never, in any strict sense, a reliable defense against the era's most sophisticated threats. It was a defense against the crude, the impatient, and the amateur. A poisoner hoping for a fast and obvious kill, while offering considerably less legitimate protection against exactly the kind of careful, incremental attack that a court as politically dangerous as the Valois household had every reason to fear most. There is something worth carrying forward from this understanding into the chapters that follow. Etienne's body was, in the most literal sense the era could offer, the last meaningful line of defense between a suspect dish and the Queen Mother of France, and yet the poisons most feared by the physicians and stewards around him were precisely the ones his body was least equipped to catch. He performed his duty every night with complete sincerity, and he performed it against the era's most dangerous and most patient threats almost entirely in vain, a fact that nobody standing at that credenza, including Etienne himself, would have found any comfort in knowing. For Etienne himself, none of this chemistry ever stayed theoretical for long, because the weight that followed every single tasting was not an abstract risk he understood intellectually and then set aside. It was a physical event that happened inside his own body, several times a night, every night he served, and the toll of it had been accumulating quietly across 3 full years before this wedding week ever arrived. If you picture the discomfort of this job at all, you probably picture a single sharp moment of fear, one dangerous swallow, followed by relief once the danger has clearly passed. That picture describes a single tasting in isolation reasonably well. It says almost nothing about what happens to a young man's body and mind after that same sequence has repeated itself thousands of times, dish after dish, night after night, for years. The actual toll on a working taster's body, as reconstructed from what survives of household medical records and the broader physiological understanding of chronic stress that modern researchers have since developed, was considerably more corrosive than a single evening's fear would suggest. A body that produces the same flood of alarm, the tightened stomach, the racing pulse, the shallow breathing, dozens of times a week for years does not simply reset itself cleanly between episodes. It accumulates wear, and the specific nature of a taster's duty made that wear unusually concentrated in exactly the organ system his job depended on most directly: his own digestive tract. A stomach subjected to repeated small doses of unfamiliar, richly spiced, heavily sauced court food, eaten under acute anxiety rather than in any calm or relaxed state, tends toward chronic irritation, a condition period physicians would have described in the language of an excess of choleric humor or a disorder of the stomach's natural heat, and that a modern physician would more likely recognize as the kind of persistent gastric distress now well documented among people living under sustained, unresolved stress. Layered on top of the physical wear sat the psychological cost of never being permitted to fully relax around food, the one activity that for almost everyone else at that court represented pleasure, status, and comfort in equal measure, and that for a working taster represented every single time a fresh occasion for genuine mortal risk. For Etienne, this toll had a specific daily shape by the third year of his service, one he had never described in full to anyone, including his own mother, because he had no vocabulary available to him that would make the description sound like anything other than complaint, and a servant in his position had learned early that complaint was a luxury he could not afford to be seen indulging. His stomach ached in a low, steady way that rarely disappeared entirely, flaring sharply whenever a dish arrived unusually rich, and he had come to associate the specific smell of certain heavily spiced sauces, cinnamon and clove worked into a thick wine reduction in particular, with a small anticipatory clench in his gut that arrived before he had even tasted anything, purely from the smell alone. He ate less, in absolute terms, than his position at a royal kitchen might suggest, because the small ceremonial portions he tasted throughout each service left him neither hungry enough nor, more honestly, brave enough to eat a full ordinary meal on top of them. And he had grown thin in a way that the other pantry servants occasionally remarked on, attributing it good-naturedly to a young man simply working too hard, never guessing at the specific mechanism behind it. Sleep came badly and unevenly, particularly in the nights immediately before a major banquet like this wedding, when Etienne would wake once or twice convinced that some ordinary ache, a cramp from lying awkwardly, a dry throat from the summer heat, was the first sign of a poisoning finally catching up to him hours after the fact, only to lie in the dark, cataloguing his own pulse and breathing until exhaustion eventually won out over fear. The broader context surrounding this toll matters because it reveals something that the elegant surface of a royal banquet, gold and heron and candlelight, was specifically designed never to show. Every dish that reached the Queen Mother's table that night arrived looking flawless, its danger already absorbed somewhere upstream by a body nobody at that table would ever think to ask about. Historians of Renaissance court life, including Robert Knecht in his broader work on the structure of the Valois household, have noted how thoroughly the physical labor and physical risk of court service was designed to remain invisible to the people it protected, a principle that applied just as completely to a taster's chronic stomach pain as it did to a laundress's raw hands or a groom's aching back. The entire performance of effortless royal luxury depended on nobody at the high table ever having to look directly at what that luxury actually cost the bodies making it possible. A queen accepting a dish from the credenza saw silver, ceremony, and calm. She was never meant to see, and by every account, never did see, the tightened stomach and the sleepless nights sitting underneath that calm. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to the specific dangers Etienne faced from the people watching him rather than from the food itself. The wear his body carried after 3 years of this work was not the result of any single dramatic incident. No near poisoning, no moment of obvious crisis anyone could point to and call the cause. It was the accumulated residue of doing an ordinary, unremarkable, repeated task under a level of sustained fear that his body had never been permitted to fully process or release, night after night, for longer than most modern jobs would ask anyone to endure a single acute crisis. Etienne would not have used the word exhaustion to describe himself, since exhaustion, to his understanding, belonged to men who worked with their backs in the fields rather than men who stood quietly at a sideboard eating small bites of rich food. But his body, in every physical sense a modern reader would recognize, was exhausted, and had been for longer than he had any real way of noticing, which brings us to the danger that Etienne actually feared more consistently, night after night, than the poison itself. Because a slow-acting toxin was at least a threat he could not control and therefore, in a strange way, could stop turning over in his mind once his official waiting period had passed. The people watching him at every single moment of his duty were a different matter entirely, and Etienne understood, with the sharp practical instinct of a servant who had learned exactly how little protection his position actually offered him, that their suspicion could end his life just as completely as any dish ever could. If you picture the security surrounding a royal taster, you probably picture the arrangement running in one direction only, the taster protecting the monarch from poison. What that picture misses entirely is the second, quieter system running in the opposite direction at the same time, an entire apparatus of observation built specifically to protect the crown from its own tasters. The actual structure of trust at a Renaissance court was considerably more paranoid and considerably more circular than the simple image of one loyal servant standing guard suggests. A taster was, by the plain logic of his position, one of the very few people in the entire household with a direct, uncomplicated opportunity to poison the royal family himself, and stewards responsible for the safety of the table understood this with the same clarity Etienne did. Every taster at a court like the Valois household worked under close, near-constant supervision from senior officers and stewards, specifically because the same access that let him detect poison would, in reversed hands, let him deliver it, and the entire system depended on layering enough independent watchers around each low servant that no single man ever had an unobserved moment with a royal dish. Tasters were watched not only during the formal act of tasting itself, but throughout their movement around the kitchens, discouraged from private conversation with cooks or pantry staff outside their immediate duties, and kept, wherever the household's resources allowed it, from developing close personal ties with any single supplier or courtier who might attempt to recruit them for a price. A taster known to be in debt, or known to have a family in particular financial distress back home, drew a specific unspoken form of additional attention from the stewards managing him, since a desperate man was understood, correctly, to be a more corruptible one. Whatever loyalty he might otherwise feel toward his post, for Etienne, this meant living inside a permanent, low-grade awareness of being watched that had become, after 3 years, almost as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and considerably harder to describe to anyone outside his position. He knew that the senior steward standing 3 feet from him at every tasting was not merely confirming that Etienne swallowed what he was supposed to swallow, but was also, quietly and continuously, assessing Etienne himself. His manner, his hesitations, any flicker of unusual behavior that might suggest he had been approached, bribed, or turned by someone with an interest in reaching the royal table through him. Etienne had learned early in his service to perform a kind of visible, legible ordinariness at all times, eating without hesitation, meeting the steward's eye rather than avoiding it, keeping his private fears entirely off his face, because a servant who looked nervous invited a suspicion that a servant who looked calm did not, regardless of what either of them actually felt underneath. He had watched, in his 2nd year of service, a fellow taster dismissed abruptly from the household after being seen speaking too long and too privately with a merchant who supplied the kitchens with spices. A conversation that may well have been entirely innocent, but that the stewards had no interest in taking any chances over. And the memory of how quickly and how completely that young man's position had simply evaporated. No trial, no formal accusation, only a sudden and permanent absence from the pantry the following week. had stayed with Etienne as a clear and constant lesson in exactly how little protection his own loyalty would offer him if anyone above him ever decided, rightly or wrongly, that he could not be trusted. The broader context surrounding this surveillance reveals just how completely the fear of poison had reshaped the ordinary texture of trust throughout the entire household. Not only between servant and monarch, but between servant and servant. Historians examining the internal politics of Renaissance royal kitchens have described an environment in which cooks watched pantry staff watched tasters, and stewards watched everyone. Each layer of the hierarchy assigned partial responsibility for catching corruption in the layer beneath it, a structure that protected the crown reasonably well at the direct cost of making. Legitimate solidarity among the kitchen's own low servants considerably harder to sustain. A taster who suspected a fellow servant of accepting a bribe faced real pressure to report it immediately, since failing to do so and being later connected to the resulting scandal carried consequences nearly as severe as the original crime itself. This meant that the very people whose shared exhausting duty might otherwise have bound Etienne and his fellow tasters together in real friendship were, at the same time, quietly incentivized to watch each other with a wariness that made deep trust between them almost structurally impossible to build. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to what happened when the system's suspicion landed, wrongly, on a servant who had done nothing at all. The credenza and its officers existed, on paper, to protect the Queen Mother from her enemies. In daily practice, an equally large share of the apparatus surrounding Etienne existed to protect the Queen Mother from him, and from every other low servant standing close enough to her table to matter, a fact that shaped his every gesture and every silence considerably more than the poison itself ever did. There is one particular fear that sat underneath every other fear Etienne carried through his 3 years of service. One that had nothing to do with an enemy of the crown and everything to do with the simple, mundane hazards of 16th century food itself. Because a taster's body did not actually need a deliberate poisoner to betray him. It only needed a piece of meat left too long in a warm larder, or a barrel of wine gone slightly foul in transit. The same ordinary hazards that sickened kitchens and households across all of Renaissance Europe with grim regularity. If you assume that a wrongly accused taster would have received the benefit of the doubt, some careful process of investigation before any punishment followed, you are assuming a level of due process that a frightened, politically unstable court had neither the patience nor, in many cases, the true interest in extending to a servant of no particular standing. The plain, uncomfortable reality is that a taster who fell ill after a service, whether from an actual poisoning or from nothing more sinister than ordinary spoiled food, presented his household with an identical set of visible symptoms and, from the perspective of a frightened court, an identical set of urgent questions. Cramping, vomiting, and fever looked the same to a 16th century physician regardless of their cause. And a court already primed by a decade of civil war to see poison in every unexplained illness had every institutional incentive to treat a sick taster as evidence of an attack first and investigate the more mundane explanation only afterward. If at all, chronicles and household records from courts across Europe in this period, not only in France but in the Ottoman and English courts operating under broadly similar systems, describe tasters and kitchen staff who fell under suspicion of treason after an illness that, examined with modern hindsight, reads far more plausibly as an unremarkable bout of food poisoning or seasonal fever than as any genuine attempt on a royal life. Many of these cases remain deeply ambiguous even to historians working from the surviving documents, since a chronicler, with every reason to suspect poison and no laboratory capable of proving otherwise, rarely left behind the kind of careful, clinical record that would let a modern reader distinguish a true poisoning from an unlucky accident centuries later. What the surviving pattern does make clear is that the burden of proof, when it existed at all, rested overwhelmingly on the servant to somehow demonstrate his own innocence, rather than on the court to first establish that a crime had actually occurred. An instructive parallel, though it comes from a different court entirely and involves a different kind of servant. Shows just how easily this dynamic could turn lethal even for a man with far more education and standing than a taster like Etienne. Rodrigo Lopes, a Portuguese Jewish physician who had risen to become chief physician to Queen Elizabeth I of England, was arrested in 1594. Convicted of plotting to poison the Queen on evidence that later historians have generally judged thin and heavily shaped by court politics and the anti-Jewish sentiment of the period, and executed despite widespread private doubt, even among some of his own accusers, about his actual guilt. Lopes was not a food taster, and his case belongs to the English rather than the French court, but the underlying pattern it illustrates: a politically vulnerable servant positioned close to royal food and health, accused on evidence that would not survive serious scrutiny, and executed anyway because the court's own anxiety demanded a resolution more than it demanded certainty, was a structural danger built into royal service across Renaissance Europe generally, and one that every low servant standing near a royal table in London or in Paris understood without needing a single specific case explained to him. For Etienne, this danger arrived not as abstract historical pattern, but as a specific, recurring private fear that shaped how he behaved every time his own stomach so much as twinged after a service. He had learned, through the same quiet apprenticeship of watching and listening that taught him every other survival skill of his position, that an ordinary stomach complaint reported too visibly, too dramatically, or at the wrong moment could be read by a frightened steward as the first sign of an authentic poisoning rather than as the unremarkable digestive misery that Etienne himself, more often than not, correctly suspected it actually was. This left him managing his own most basic bodily discomfort with a kind of careful, strategic silence, deciding in the moment whether a given ache was severe enough to risk the scrutiny that reporting it honestly would invite, or ordinary enough that concealing it, gritting through the discomfort in silence, was the safer choice for a boy in his position. He had watched a fellow servant, sick for 2 days with what was almost certainly nothing more than an ordinary seasonal flux common enough at that time of year, questioned closely and unpleasantly by a steward before finally being allowed to recover and return to his post. An episode that resolved without formal punishment, but that left every taster who witnessed it, Etienne included, considerably more careful about how loudly and how quickly they ever admitted to feeling unwell again. The broader context surrounding this danger connects directly back to the same desperate economic calculation that had brought Etienne into royal service in the first place. A family like the Brachets, dependent on a son's wages to survive, had no meaningful recourse if that son was ever wrongly accused. No lawyer to hire, no noble patron obligated to intervene on his behalf. No political faction with any interest in defending a miller's orphaned son against a charge the Crown itself had reason to want resolved quickly and visibly. The same low status that made Etienne cheap and safe to place at the credenza in the first place made him, in the event that suspicion ever turned on him unfairly, almost entirely without protection. This was not a flaw in the system from the perspective of the people running it. It was, in a very direct sense, the same underlying logic operating in both directions. A servant valuable precisely because his life, and by extension his death, carried no political weight that anyone above him needed to account for. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with before this hour turns to the woman at the head of that table, and the reputation that shaped every fear this chapter has described. The danger Etienne lived with was never only the danger of poison, and it was never only the danger of suspicion either. It was the compounded danger of being a person whose body absorbed every risk a royal table generated, deliberate or accidental, without ever receiving in return the one thing that might have made any of it survivable. A court willing to extend him the same benefit of the doubt it would have extended, without a second thought, to anyone born with a title attached to their name. There is a reason this story is still told the way it is told, 4.5 centuries later, and that reason sits at the head of the very table Etienne served every night. Catherine de' Medici's name has carried the weight of poison for longer than almost any other reputation in European history, and understanding how much of that reputation was earned and how much of it was built by people with every reason to want her seen as a monster changes considerably how we should picture the fear running through her own household in 1572. If you assume that a reputation as dark and as persistent as Catherine's must reflect a settled historical fact, confirmed poisonings, documented victims, a body of evidence a modern court would recognize, you are assuming a level of historical certainty that 4 centuries of careful scholarship have never actually managed to produce. The plain reality is that no historian working today can point to a single confirmed instance of Catherine de' Medici personally ordering a poisoning that modern evidence supports beyond reasonable doubt, and biographers who have spent entire careers on her life, among them Leone Frida, whose biography remains one of the most widely read modern accounts of Catherine's life, have concluded that separating the actual woman from the myth surrounding her requires wading through centuries of hostile political pamphleteering that had every incentive to make her look monstrous, whether or not the underlying accusations held up. Catherine arrived in France in 1533 as a 14-year-old Florentine bride, a foreigner in a court that never fully stopped treating her as one, and Italy's own reputation across 16th century Europe as the supposed homeland of sophisticated, undetectable poisoning gave French observers a ready-made villain to reach for whenever an inconvenient death needed an explanation. She had, in fact, brought her own perfumer from Florence, a man named Renato Bianco, known at the French court as René the Florentine, whose legitimate trade was scented gloves, soaps, and cosmetics rather than poison, but whose foreign origin and close personal access to the Queen made him an irresistible figure for rumour to seize upon. When Jeanne d'Albret died in June of 1572, an autopsy performed at the time attributed her death to natural causes, most likely an infection of the lung that a modern physician would probably recognize as tuberculosis or a severe pleurisy, and no evidence beyond hostile rumor ever connected her death to Catherine or to René's gloves at all. The accusation nonetheless spread quickly and stuck permanently, first through Huguenot chroniclers like Agrippa d'Aubigné writing in the years immediately following, and then through a much wider and more deliberately constructed campaign that would follow only 3 years after this wedding. That campaign arrived in 1575 in the form of an anonymous pamphlet titled The Discours Merveilleux, published in the aftermath of the very massacre this wedding week would soon produce, and widely, though never definitively attributed to the Huguenot printer and scholar Henri Estienne, though modern scholars researching its authorship have also floated other names and continue to debate the question without full resolution. The pamphlet presented Catherine as a scheming foreign poisoner who had spent decades manipulating and murdering her way toward absolute control of France, and it proved enormously successful in exactly the way its authors intended. Running through at least 9 separate French editions within its first 4 years alone, and appearing in English, Latin, and German translations almost immediately, spreading an image of Catherine across Protestant Europe that would outlast the specific political conflict that produced it by hundreds of years. Historians studying the pamphlet's reception have noted that its authors were not attempting anything resembling careful historical inquiry. They were writing wartime propaganda in the aftermath of a massacre that had killed thousands of their own coreligionists, and a foreign-born Queen Mother already primed by decades of casual Italian poisoner stereotypes made an obvious and effective target for exactly the kind of demonization a traumatized political movement reaches, for when it needs to explain catastrophe through the deliberate malice of a single identifiable villain. None of this means Catherine de' Medici was a woman without real political ruthlessness, and separating her from an invented poisoning legend is not the same as declaring her innocent of everything her enemies accused her of. She was, by the documented record every serious historian accepts, deeply involved in the political calculations that led to the assassination attempt against Gaspard de Coligny only days after this wedding, an attempt that failed to kill him outright and instead triggered a chain of panicked decisions among the Catholic leadership, Catherine included by most modern accounts. That helped trigger the massacre of Huguenots across Paris, beginning on the night of the 23rd of August and continuing for days afterward, a slaughter that historians including Barbara Defendorf have documented killing several thousand people in the capital alone and considerably more across the provinces in the weeks that followed. This was calculated political violence, conducted openly enough that its architects never bothered denying their involvement to each other, even if they later worked hard to obscure it from history. It was not secret poison slipped into a cup. The two kinds of danger, open political murder and secret chemical murder, both real forces shaping Catherine's court, have simply been folded together over 4 centuries into a single flattened caricature of a scheming poisoner queen. A caricature that obscures more about how Renaissance power actually operated than it reveals. For Etienne, none of this historical nuance would have meant very much. Standing at his post through the very week that produced both the wedding and, within days, the massacre that followed it. What he understood, in the plain and practical terms available to a 19-year-old servant, was that the woman he served was widely believed, by friend and enemy alike, to understand poison intimately, and that belief alone, whether or not it reflected anything Catherine had actually done, shaped every fear running through the kitchens beneath her. A steward who believed his mistress capable of poisoning her enemies had every reason to assume her enemies were equally capable of poisoning her in return, and it was this belief, this reputation, circulating through the household regardless of its underlying truth, that justified every hour Etienne spent at the credenza, every unicorn horn fragment dipped into a suspect sauce, every anxious minute of waiting after every tasting. The legend did not need to be true to shape his entire working life. It only needed to be believed by the people with the power to decide how carefully a queen's food should be guarded, and by 1572, after decades of pamphlets and rumour and one fully documented massacre unfolding in real time around him, it was believed by nearly everyone. The broader context worth carrying forward from this chapter is not a simple verdict on Catherine's guilt or innocence, since 4 centuries of dedicated scholarship have failed to produce one, and this hour has no better claim to certainty than they did. It is the recognition that a reputation, once it calcifies into common knowledge, does real work in the world regardless of how much verified fact actually supports it. Catherine de' Medici's court spent a fortune on unicorn horn and toadstone rings and rotating tasters, partly because poison was a genuine, well-documented danger of the era, and partly because everyone at that court, Catherine very much included, had been raised on stories about exactly how dangerous a woman like her was supposed to be capable of being. The fear built the ritual. The ritual employed Etienne. And Etienne's own body absorbed the cost of a reputation that historians, working carefully and honestly across 4 centuries since, still cannot fully confirm was ever deserved in the first place. Step back from the credenza for a moment and look at the wider shape of the household surrounding it, because Etienne's situation, however specific its details, was never really unique to him, or to Catherine's court, or even to France. The same basic arrangement, luxury sitting visibly on top of a foundation of terrified, expendable labour, repeated itself across nearly every royal household in Renaissance Europe, and understanding how widespread that pattern was changes how we should read Etienne's own choices, and his mother's, when this position was first offered to a grieving family with nowhere else to turn. If you assume that a family desperate enough to send a son into a job this dangerous must have been unusually poor or unusually careless with his safety, you are picturing a level of choice that simply did not exist for most households at the bottom of Renaissance Europe's economic ladder. The actual reality facing a family like the Brachets was considerably starker than any single bad decision. A widow with 4 children and a small inherited debt in 16th century France, had access to almost no institutional support beyond what her own extended family, her parish, or a fortunate connection could provide. And the ordinary alternatives available to a boy in Etienne's position: apprenticeship to a trade that required capital his family did not have, agricultural labor that paid barely enough to feed one person, let alone contribute to a household, or a life of casual and unreliable day work in a nearby town, offered nothing close to the steady wage, guaranteed food, and roof over one's head that royal service provided. Economic historians examining household budgets across this period have consistently found that domestic service at even the lowest rungs of a great household represented one of the few reliably stable forms of income available to the rural poor, since a servant's food and lodging were provided directly rather than purchased out of an uncertain wage, which meant that a position most modern readers would recognize instantly as dangerous and exploitative looked, from the vantage point of a desperate 16th century family, like one of the only doors actually open to them. Etienne's mother did not send her son into danger because she failed to grasp what the position asked of him. She sent him because the alternative, a household with no reliable income at all, carried a danger to her remaining children that felt, in that moment, considerably more immediate and more certain than a risk her son might or might not ever actually encounter at a royal table 3 days' ride from home. This same calculation repeated itself, with only minor local variation, across nearly every court in Renaissance Europe that maintained a system of royal tasters. Sources examining kitchen staffing at the Ottoman court in Constantinople, at the Tudor court in England, and across the various Italian city-states whose reputation for sophisticated poisoning made their own rulers especially anxious about exactly this danger, describe an almost identical pattern. Low-born servants recruited from populations with few other options, absorbing a risk that the nobility surrounding them would never have accepted for their own sons, in exchange for a wage and a stability that made the arrangement, however dangerous, rational rather than reckless from the servant's own point of view. The luxury visible at any of these courts, the silver, the spiced wine, the gilded pastry, was never actually paid for solely in gold. It was paid for in an equally direct and considerably less visible sense, in the accumulated risk absorbed by servants whose names rarely survive in any record beyond a household account book listing their modest annual wage. For Etienne, the wedding week itself would end not in the quiet aftermath a royal marriage might normally produce, but in the very violence this hour has already described unfolding around him. In the pre-dawn hours of the 24th of August, only days after the banquet Etienne had served, church bells across Paris began the signal that opened what history remembers as the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, and the armed Huguenot nobles who had eaten from Etienne's own credenza that wedding night became targets, over the following hours and days, of a slaughter that spread from the palace itself out into the streets of the city and, in the weeks that followed, into the provinces beyond it. Etienne's own role in the days that followed the wedding banquet would have shrunk dramatically in significance next to the scale of what unfolded around him. A servant's private terror about poison in a single dish, reduced to almost nothing beside armed men moving room to room through a palace he had served in only nights before. The household continued to function through the crisis in the mechanical way that royal households generally did. Meals still prepared, dishes still tasted, ordinary domestic labor continuing underneath extraordinary political violence. Because a kitchen the size of the Louvre's did not stop needing servants simply because the city outside its walls had turned murderous. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Etienne's specific fear, the fear this entire hour has walked through in such careful physical detail, the wait after a tasting, the surveillance of a suspicious steward, the low chronic ache of a stomach worn down by years of anxious small bites, was never actually the largest danger present in that palace during the week we have spent with him. It was simply the danger closest to his own body, the one he could feel directly rather than read about afterward in a chronicler's account. A boy standing at a credenza worrying about arsenic in a sauce had no way of knowing that the largest single act of religious violence his century would produce was going to erupt from the very wedding he was helping to serve, within days of his own careful, anxious tasting of the heron pie and the honeyed wine. The broader context worth carrying forward from this chapter connects the small, personal danger this hour has spent so long examining to the much larger political danger that made it necessary in the first place. Renaissance royal luxury, the gold and silver and endless courses of a state banquet, was never simply decoration. It was a performance of stability staged, night after night, by a court that was in fact deeply unstable, and every layer of ceremony surrounding that performance, the officers of the mouth, the credenza, the unicorn horn, the low expendable body of a boy like Etienne standing quietly at the edge of the hall, existed because the instability was real, and everyone at that table, from the Queen Mother down to the youngest page, knew it. The heron pie looked flawless because a frightened miller's son had already tasted it. The peace looked secured because a marriage had joined two warring families at the altar. Neither the food nor the peace was ever quite as safe as either one was made to appear, and the difference between appearance and reality, in both cases, was paid for by people whose names the historical record barely bothered to preserve. There is a quiet observation worth carrying into the final chapters of this hour. Etienne Brachet was never protecting Catherine de Medici from a single dramatic assassin waiting in the wings with a vial of poison. No matter how completely his training and his nightly ritual assumed exactly that shape of danger. He was one small, expendable piece of a much larger machine built to manufacture the appearance of safety inside a court that both its own people and its enemies understood correctly to be truly dangerous, and the true danger threatening that court in August of 1572 turned out, in the end, to have almost nothing to do with poison at all. There is a final question worth asking before this hour steps back from Etienne entirely. One that the drama of poison and massacre alike tends to crowd out of the story. What actually became of a man who survived this work, assuming the food and the politics both spared him, and what did years of this particular endurance actually buy a servant in the long run? If you picture a loyal royal servant's career at all, you probably picture some eventual reward for years of faithful risk. A promotion, a pension, a grateful mention in a household record recognizing service rendered. That picture belongs to a much later and more bureaucratic understanding of employment than 16th century royal service ever actually offered the men occupying its lowest ranks. The plain reality documented in what survives of household account books and staffing records from courts across this period is that a low servant's career rarely moved very far from where it began, regardless of how many years of dangerous, faithful duty he accumulated along the way. A taster who survived his early years at the credenza without falling under suspicion, without succumbing to the chronic digestive strain the work imposed, and without simply being replaced by a younger, cheaper recruit as household budgets shifted, might eventually be moved into a somewhat less exposed pantry role once his experience made him useful for training newer servants. A shift in duty that historians studying kitchen hierarchies describe as the closest thing available to advancement for a man of his station. Wages for these lower positions moved upward only marginally across a working lifetime, and the small independence a servant like Etienne might hope for, enough saved to eventually marry, to rent a modest room of his own rather than sleeping in shared household quarters, remained, for most men in his position, a distant and uncertain prospect rather than a guaranteed outcome of years of loyal risk. The rare exceptions, a servant noticed and elevated by a patron who took a personal liking to him, a lucky marriage into a family with slightly more standing, a position that opened up through simple accident of timing, existed and were remembered precisely because they were exceptions, told and retold as evidence that advancement was possible in a system that mostly did not deliver it. For a man like Etienne, the most plausible version of the years following this wedding week looks considerably quieter than the drama of the massacre unfolding around him that same August. He very likely continued in royal service for years afterward, the wedding banquet and the killing that followed it fading into one especially vivid memory among many similar nights of anxious, repetitive duty. His wages continuing to travel home twice yearly by the same trusted carter, his mother's household slowly stabilizing as his younger siblings grew old enough to contribute their own labor and eventually marry into households of their own. He would have aged into the more senior, less directly exposed role that experience eventually earned a servant who survived long enough to claim it. Training younger boys exactly as frightened as he had once been in the same rituals of assay and credenza that had shaped his own body for so many years, passing down the same private catalogue of warning signs, the tight chest, the metallic taste, the cold sweat, that he himself had once turned over anxiously in the dark before learning, slowly and through nothing more dramatic than the accumulation of uneventful nights, which twinges deserved his fear and which did not. Whether he ever fully escaped the low, chronic ache in his stomach that 3 years of anxious tasting had already given him by the time of this wedding, the documented physiological pattern behind that kind of sustained stress suggests he likely did not. At least not completely, even after his most dangerous years of direct tasting duty had passed into memory. The broader context surrounding this quiet, unglamorous trajectory matters because it corrects one final comfortable assumption a modern listener might otherwise carry away from this story. The idea that unusual courage or unusual suffering must surely be rewarded with some equally unusual outcome. Some visible turn of fortune that makes the risk retroactively worthwhile. Renaissance royal service, for a servant born at the bottom of its hierarchy, rarely worked that way. The reward for surviving years of actual physical and psychological risk was, overwhelmingly, simply more years of service, a continuation rather than a transformation. And the household that had asked Etienne to place his own body between a suspect dish and the Queen Mother's mouth night after night owed him, by the unwritten but thoroughly understood logic of his era, nothing more than his wages and his bed once that service was rendered. There is a quiet observation worth carrying into the final reflection this hour has been building toward. Etienne Brachet's life, in every version of it that the surviving evidence of his era makes plausible, was never going to end in a dramatic reversal of fortune, a noble reward, a story with a clean and satisfying close. It was going to continue, quietly, the way most lives at the bottom of a hierarchy like this one continued. Service folding into service. One anxious night resembling the last. His own body absorbing a cost that the household above him would never be asked to fully reckon with. And that history, left to its own devices, would never have bothered to record at all. Step back now from Etienne's own body, from the credenza and the unicorn horn, and the wedding feast that framed his most dangerous night of service, and a handful of larger patterns come into view. Patterns that connect every chapter of this hour into something more than a single frightened boy's account of a single dangerous job. The first pattern is this. Every layer of safety this hour has described, the tasting itself, the officers of the mouth, the fragment of narwhal ivory standing on its silver stand, the toadstone ring Etienne's mother pressed into his hand before he left for court, existed to manufacture a feeling rather than to guarantee an outcome. A queen sitting down to a state banquet in 1572 was never actually protected from a sufficiently patient poisoner, and the surgeon Ambroise Père had already proven, 5 years before this wedding, that the era's most trusted antidote failed its one direct test. What all of that ritual actually delivered was calm, a visible, witnessed performance of safety solid enough that 200 armed nobles from opposing sides of a religious war could sit down at the same table and eat. The same is true of the peace the wedding itself was meant to represent. A marriage between a Catholic princess and a Protestant prince did not resolve a single one of the political and religious tensions tearing France apart that summer. It performed a resolution, visibly and ceremonially, in front of exactly the audience that needed to believe the performance in order for the fragile truce to hold even a few days longer. The credenza and the altar were doing the identical work that August, manufacturing belief through witnessed ritual precisely because the underlying reality neither one of them could offer was authentic security. The second pattern sits directly beneath the first, and it is considerably harder to look at directly. Every ounce of that manufactured calm was purchased with a body that was not the body of anyone it protected. Catherine de Medici's own mouth never touched a dish that Etienne Brachet's mouth had not already touched first, and the political peace celebrated at that wedding was built, in no small part, on the calculation that a decade of civil war had made certain lives, Huguenot and Catholic alike, spendable in the pursuit of stability for everyone else. This is not a coincidence of court life in 1572. It is close to the entire operating principle of hierarchy itself, in this era and in most eras since. That the risk generated by instability gets absorbed disproportionately by the people with the least power to refuse it, while the appearance of safety gets enjoyed, undisturbed, by the people at the top of the structure the risk was designed to protect. Etienne's stomach, worn raw by 3 years of anxious small bites, is not really a story about food. It is a story about exactly where, in a system built this way, the actual cost of luxury and stability ends up landing. The third pattern concerns belief itself, and how thoroughly it can substitute for evidence when a frightened enough population needs an answer badly enough. The unicorn horn on Etienne's sideboard never once reacted to anything in 3 years, and the most respected surgeon in France had already demonstrated the failure of the bezoar stone through an experiment his own king's court had every reason to take seriously. None of that evidence meaningfully weakened the daily practice built around these objects, because a belief performed with enough consistency, night after night, in front of enough witnesses, becomes functionally indistinguishable from a fact for the people living inside it. The same mechanism explains how a woman whose actual documented crimes were political rather than chemical, serious as those political crimes truly were, became remembered for 4 centuries primarily as a poisoner, on the strength of a hostile pamphlet published by people who needed a villain considerably more than they needed a verified fact. Catherine de Medici's household spent a fortune guarding against poison, partly because poison was a real danger of the era, and partly because everyone in that household, Catherine very much included, had absorbed a set of beliefs about exactly how dangerous a court like theirs was capable of being. The fear built the ritual, regardless of whether the underlying claim justifying it could survive close examination, which is precisely the same mechanism sitting underneath the toadstone ring and the pamphlet alike. The fourth pattern is the quietest, and perhaps the one most worth carrying away from an entire hour spent inside Etienne Brachet's stomach and his fear. Desperation and choice were never actually opposites at the Valois court, no matter how cleanly a modern listener might want to separate them. Etienne chose, in the narrowest technical sense, to accept a position at the royal credenza, the way a young noble chose to compete for the title of a canson, the way Catherine herself chose the political calculations that shaped a decade of her reign. None of these choices happened inside anything resembling equal conditions. A young lord's son chose proximity to power from a position of relative comfort, weighing an opportunity against modest alternatives. Etienne chose continued service to his mother's household from a position that offered him, in practical terms, no real alternative at all. A choice so constrained by circumstance that calling it a choice risks obscuring exactly how little freedom it actually contained. Understanding this does not require pitying Etienne, and it does not require imagining him as a passive victim with no agency of his own. He acted every single night with real courage and real steadiness under a pressure that would have broken plenty of people considerably less desperate than he was. It only requires holding 2 things true at once: that he chose this life, and that the world around him had made sure he had almost nothing else left to choose from. There is something clarifying about seeing all 4 of these patterns laid out together, rather than encountering them one chapter at a time the way this hour has presented them. The gold on that banquet table, the peace between Catholic and Huguenot lords, the fragment of ivory standing sentinel on the credenza, and the reputation of the woman presiding over all of it were never separate phenomena. They were four expressions of the identical underlying fact that a court this unstable, this frightened, and this dangerous could only continue functioning by manufacturing the visible appearance of stability, safety, protection, and control. And that manufacturing required labor, most of it invisible, most of it unpaid in anything beyond a modest wage and a bed, most of it performed by people whose names the historical record never thought worth writing down. Etienne Brachet is not really a footnote to Catherine de Medici's story. He is the part of the story that makes the rest of it make sense, the specific human cost sitting quietly underneath every gleaming surface this era ever managed to produce. Return, for a moment, to the hall where this hour began. The linen is still pressed flat across 60 feet of table, the candlelight still lying over it in unbroken sheets, and the roast heron still arrives dressed in its own feathers, appearing, for one theatrical instant, to be resting rather than dead. Catherine de Medici still sits near the head of that table, in her black silk, watchful, heavy-jawed, composed. Nothing about the physical scene has changed since the opening image of this hour. What has changed is everything you now know about what that scene required in order to exist at all. You know now that the heron pie, no matter how beautiful its gilded crust looked under 200 candles, had already passed through the hands of a 19-year-old miller's son who broke that crust apart with his fingers, checking for anything hidden inside it. Before placing a piece in his own mouth and chewing it slowly enough for a steward to watch every motion of his jaw. You know that the honeyed wine had been sipped first from the same heavy ewer that would soon fill the Queen Mother's cup, held a beat longer than necessary in a boy's mouth in case a slower swallow gave him a moment's more warning. You know that a fragment of what the entire court sincerely believed was unicorn horn sat in a small silver stand near that boy's station, dipped occasionally into a rich sauce on the theory that it would sweat or discolor if poison were present, and that it never once did in 3 years of nightly service, whether or not anything dangerous had ever actually been near it. You know that the toadstone ring on his finger came from his own mother, purchased at real cost from a travelling peddler, carried less for its promised power than for the plain comfort of wearing something she had chosen specifically to keep her son alive. You also know now that the peace being celebrated at that table was every bit as constructed as the ritual protecting the food on it. A marriage between a Catholic princess and a Protestant prince did not resolve 10 years of religious war. It performed a resolution, visibly, in front of exactly the armed and mutually suspicious nobles who needed to believe in it for the fragile truce to survive even a few more days, and within a week of this banquet, church bells across Paris would signal the beginning of a massacre that killed thousands of the very guests eating from Etienne's own credenza that night. The gold on that table, the silver serving pieces worked into dolphins and serpents, the pastry gilded with real gold leaf, none of it was decoration in any simple sense. It was armor, dressed up as splendor, worn by a court that understood, at every level from the Queen Mother down to the boy tasting her wine, exactly how unsafe the room actually was underneath its own performance of calm. And you know, finally, that a significant share of what made this specific room feel this dangerous was reputation rather than proven fact. Catherine de Medici's name had already carried the weight of poison for years by 1572, built less from confirmed crime than from a foreign-born queen's convenient fit into an old and useful stereotype. Sharpened by the death of Jeanne d'Albret 2 months earlier, a death and autopsy attributed to natural illness and rumour attributed to a pair of scented gloves. And it would be sharpened further, only 3 years later, by an anonymous pamphlet that turned decades of half-proven whisper into the fixed historical caricature most people still carry of her today. None of this means the danger in that hall was imaginary. The political violence Catherine helped set in motion within days of this wedding was entirely real, and historians studying it have never needed an invented poisoning to establish how ruthless her court could be. It means only that the specific fear shaping Etienne's nightly ritual, the credenza, the unicorn horn, the endless anxious waiting, drew as much of its force from a legend that outran the evidence as from any confirmed act of poisoning that legend claimed to explain. Look again at Catherine de' Medici, sitting composed and watchful at the head of that gleaming table, and she is not the villain of the pamphlets, not entirely. And she is not the innocent victim of circumstance either. She is a woman who arrived in France at 14 as a foreign bride nobody fully trusted, who buried a husband and would go on to bury most of her own children, who spent 4 decades learning to survive inside a court that mythologized her as a poisoner while she made the hard, blood-soaked political calculations that come with holding real power in a country tearing itself apart. She is, in other words, considerably more complicated than either the legend or a simple correction of the legend can fully capture. A person managing real danger with real ruthlessness inside a story that other people, with their own reasons for wanting her monstrous, have been rewriting for 450 years. Look past her, to the boy standing quietly at the sideboard along the wall, and the reframing lands somewhere quieter, and, in its own way, considerably harder to look away from. Etienne Brachet is not in any painting made of this evening. No portrait immortalizes the particular way his stomach tightened as the heron pie arrived, or the private ritual of naming his mother and his 3 younger siblings before he swallowed anything unfamiliar, or the low chronic ache that 3 years of anxious small bites had already carved into a body still young enough that no one glancing at him across the hall would have guessed at any of it. He is exactly what the entire architecture of that banquet was built to make invisible, the actual cost of the calm everyone else in that room was permitted to enjoy without ever having to think about where it came from. There is a version of this story that ends with pity, and it is worth pausing on why that version would be the wrong one to leave you with. Etienne Brachet was not a passive object acted upon by forces too large for him to touch. He performed a specific, demanding duty with real steadiness, night after night, under conditions that would have unraveled plenty of people handed the same impossible choice. He fed a family that would otherwise have gone without. He carried his fear quietly, managed it with private rituals of his own invention, and returned to that sideboard every single evening despite 3 years of accumulating evidence, written directly into his own aching body, of exactly what the work was costing him. That is not the profile of a victim with no agency of his own. It is the profile of a young man doing something truly difficult, doing it well, and receiving almost none of the recognition that difficulty would have earned a person born a few rungs higher on the same ladder. Nor is this a story that asks you to condemn the court that employed him, or Catherine de' Medici specifically, as though a single villain could be identified and blamed for an entire social system built across centuries and repeated, in broadly similar form, at nearly every wealthy household in Renaissance Europe. The Valo court did not invent the practice of protecting the powerful with the bodies of the powerless. It inherited that practice from every hierarchy that came before it, refined it under the specific pressure of a religious civil war and a queen whose reputation, deserved or not, made her household unusually anxious, and passed a version of the same arrangement forward to the courts that followed, judging 1572 by the standards of a world that would not exist for centuries, accomplishes very little beyond making a modern listener feel appropriately superior to people who had no access to the knowledge, the institutions, or the options that a listener today simply takes for granted. What accomplishes considerably more is looking clearly, without flinching and without judgment, at what that world actually asked of the people living inside its lowest ranks, and letting that clarity sit exactly where it lands. And where it lands, finally, is here. A banquet hall in the Louvre, August of 1572, gold-catching candlelight across 60 feet of pressed linen. a queen in black silk, watchful and composed, carrying a reputation considerably darker than the evidence for it has ever fully supported, presiding over a peace that will not survive the week. A roast heron dressed in its own feathers, a wine the color of dark honey, a pastry gilded in gold leaf thin enough to eat, and at the edge of it all, unnamed in every painting, unremembered in every account written by anyone who mattered enough to have their account preserved, a 19-year-old boy standing at a sideboard with a stomach that has ached for 3 straight years, a toadstone ring on his finger that his mother pressed there herself, and a private habit of naming his family in the half-second before he swallows anything he cannot be certain of. He is not the porcelain figure the paintings of this era prefer, standing decoratively at the margins of someone else's triumph. He is a person managing a dangerous, thoroughly thankless job with whatever steadiness a frightened 19-year-old can actually summon, night after night. Because his mother and his 3 younger siblings are counting on the wages that job provides, and because refusing it was never a door that was actually open to him. He will likely go on doing this work for years after this particular wedding fades into memory, absorbing a cost that the household above him will never be asked to reckon with, training the next frightened boy to do exactly what he has learnt to do, and sending money home twice a year by the same trusted carter until a debt is finally paid and a family is finally, quietly, safe. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that his name and the names of every servant who stood exactly where he stood across every royal household of this era survive nowhere in the record that history actually bothered to keep. What survives instead are the paintings, the gold, the black silk, the legend of a poisoner queen built more from fear and propaganda than from proven fact, all of it resting, quietly and completely unremarked upon, on a foundation of ordinary human endurance that nobody thought worth writing down. Understanding this does not require rewriting the paintings or tearing down the legend entirely. It only requires knowing, the next time a gleaming banquet table from this era catches your eye, exactly whose body made that gleam possible, and exactly what it cost him, one anxious swallow at a time, to let everyone else in the room believe, for one more evening, that they were safe. The candles in that hall have long since burned down to nothing, and the linen has been folded away for 4.5 centuries. But somewhere underneath every account of that wedding night, underneath the gold and the silk and the legend both, a boy is still standing quietly at his post, doing the one thing history never thought to notice, and doing it well. It is worth asking, before this hour finally lets that image settle into silence, how long a job like Etienne's actually persisted after 1572. Because the answer says something about how slowly a fear this deeply rooted actually loosens its hold on a culture. Royal households across Europe kept some version of the tasting ritual alive for generations after this wedding, the credenza and its officers surviving, in gradually diminishing and increasingly ceremonial form, well into the following century, even as the underlying medical and chemical understanding behind it began, slowly and unevenly, to shift. The unicorn horn did not vanish from European courts because anyone definitively proved it powerless. It receded slowly, alongside the toadstone and the serpent's tongue, as the science of chemistry itself matured into something closer to what a modern reader would recognize, offering courts new and considerably more reliable tools for detecting the specific poisons that had haunted Etienne's century, even as belief in the older charms lingered stubbornly in some households long after better. Methods existed. The office of taster itself did not disappear so much as it thinned, gradually, as the political violence that had made poison feel like an urgent daily threat eased across the following centuries, and as monarchies themselves slowly ceded the kind of absolute, precarious power that had made a queen's single meal feel like it might decide the fate of an entire kingdom. What replaced the fear was not any single dramatic discovery. It was simply time and slowly accumulating stability, and a world that gradually stopped needing quite so many frightened young men standing at quite so many royal sideboards. None of that later history reaches back to change anything about the particular August night this hour has spent inside. Etienne Brachet lived and worked at the exact point in that long, slow transition when the old charms and the old fears were still taken with complete seriousness by nearly everyone around him. When a fragment of narwhal ivory still stood sentinel beside a 19-year-old's aching stomach, and when the actual chemistry capable of explaining what arsenic did to a human body was still more than 2 centuries away from being properly understood. He served in the last decades when a job exactly like his still felt, to the people employing him, like the most rational and necessary precaution a dangerous world could offer, and he carried the full physical and psychological weight of that necessity in a body that history, for 4.5 centuries afterward, simply forgot to mention. Consider too what this particular story asks of the way we tend to remember eras like this one at all. Popular memory of the Valois court runs almost entirely through its surfaces: the portraits, the gowns, the tapestries, the marriages arranged like moves on a chessboard, and the single lurid caricature of a poisoner queen presiding over all of it. That surface is not false. Catherine de' Medici truly did dress in black for the rest of her life after her husband's death, truly did preside over a court capable of real and calculated political violence, and truly did become, whether she deserved it or not, one of the most feared women in 16th century Europe. But a surface this polished only stays this polished because an entire second layer of the story, the layer made of tasters and laundresses and grooms and pantry boys, gets edited out of the frame before the portrait is ever hung. Etienne Brachet's absence from every painting made of this wedding is not an oversight. It is the whole system working exactly as it was designed to work, producing a version of history smooth enough that nobody looking at it would think to ask who tasted the wine first. That is, in the end, what a story like this one is actually for. Not to replace one simple picture of the past with an equally simple picture of misery in its place, as though every gilded hall must secretly conceal nothing but suffering and every smiling portrait must be a lie. Etienne found real comfort in a mother's ring, real pride in wages sent home, real steadiness in a job he performed well despite every reason to fail at it. Catherine found, whatever else is true of her, 4 decades of survival inside a court that would have destroyed a considerably less careful woman within a single year of her arrival. Both things were true in that hall at the same time: the splendor and the fear, the performance and the cost, and neither one cancels the other out. What a story like this one is actually for is holding both of those truths in view together, long enough to see the whole scene clearly, rather than settling for whichever half of it happens to be easier to look at. None of this required inventing anything about the world Etienne moved through. The credenza, the officers of the mouth, the trial of assay performed in triplicate, the narwhal ivory sold across Europe as unicorn horn, the bezoar stone that failed Ambroise Paré's own test in 1567, the death of Jeanne d'Albret, and the rumour that followed it, the discours merveilleux and the decades of pamphleteering that shaped Catherine de' Medici's reputation more thoroughly than any court record ever did. All of it is documented in the surviving sources historians have spent careers assembling. From household accounts to physicians' writings to the biographies of Frida, Knecht, and Diffendorf that continue to separate the woman from the legend built around her. What required invention was only the specific boy standing at that specific sideboard on that specific August night, a single face given to a role that hundreds of real, nameless young men actually filled across the courts of Renaissance Europe, doing exactly the work this hour has described, absorbing exactly the risk, and leaving behind, in the overwhelming majority of cases, no more trace of their existence than a line in a household ledger recording a modest annual wage. That absence is itself a kind of evidence. A court capable of recording, in exhaustive and loving detail, the exact weight of gold leaf on a single ceremonial pastry rarely bothered to record the name of the boy who tasted it first. And the gap between those two facts tells you almost everything you need to know about whose comfort that entire elaborate system was actually designed to protect. So let the image rest here, finally, exactly where it began. The hall in the Louvre, gold-catching candlelight, a queen in black silk at the head of a table she has spent 40 years learning to survive, a roast heron, a honeyed wine, a pastry gilded thin enough to eat, and a boy at the edge of it all, unnamed in every account, his stomach aching, his mother's ring on his finger, doing the quiet, unglamorous, entirely necessary work of tasting death first, so that everyone else in that glittering room could go on believing, for one more night, that they were safe. He is the part of this portrait no painter ever thought to include. He is also, in the end, the part of it that was actually holding the whole scene together. The candles have burned low now. The wine has long since gone cold in cups nobody living was ever meant to remember pouring. And somewhere underneath every gilded account of that August night, a boy is still standing quietly at his post, doing the one thing history never thought to notice, and doing it well. Sleep well.